You're watching News at Prime. Let's get into this conversation now. The South African Post Office is warning of liquidation if it does not receive a 4 billion rand bailout. The parastatal has been under business rescue for more than a year now. Former Post Office CEO Mark Barnes is with us tonight to discuss whether the SOE can be saved. Mark, good evening to you, and thank you very much for your time. I will keep that question for the very last point in our conversation, as to whether or not you want the post office. But let's start with, when you hear the news that here it is again with a begging bowl asking for a bailout, what comes to mind for you, given that you were at the helm of this organization between 2016 and 2019?
Thank you. Well, the inevitability of it is staring us in the face. If you look at the last 3 years, I left 5 years ago. If you look at the 3 years after that, when I left, we had a solvent post office with more than 5 billion in net assets. We had a post bank which had 4.6 billion in cash in money market deposits. We had no liability, no borrowings, no treasury guarantee, and we were scheduled to turn profitable in the following year. Okay, and I was not making any request for the medium-term budget allocation. So that's where I left. And since then, we've had, an unexplained destruction of value. So the losses are muted to be 2.2 billion a year, so call that 6.6 over those 3 years, but yet we had a negative NAV, negative net asset value. At one stage it was reported that the liabilities exceeded the assets by 12.5 billion. Yeah. There's a huge gap, but that's the past, the unexplained past, if I might say so. And that's not our job tonight. That's the job of the SIU and the NPA and the Auditor General and others to try and figure out. Unfortunately, in South Africa, we've become immune to big numbers. We go like, oh, so-and-so's owed 60 billion, and you go, yeah, and what else happened today? And so we cannot afford to be immune to these things. It's a lot of money. And so that was that. Then the business rescue practitioners are called in at extraordinary cost to the public. I think I read that they were costing 140 million rand for their trouble. That's about 30 years of my salary as the CEO, okay?
Do they come at that price?
Well, that's what I read somewhere. I've got absolutely no internal information available to me. So this is just what I read in various reports, whether or not it's true. But and so now we find ourselves where you've done a compromise with creditors so that they're getting 12 cents in the rand, I understand.
Yeah.
And yet you have the Deputy Minister, Gugumbera, saying that in June 2023, we had a negative of 7.9 billion in the post office, and now you'll be pleased to know we've got plus 840 million.
Yeah.
Well, I can add, okay? And I go, really? There's a company in business rescue that's insolvent that somehow made 9 billion last year. Okay, so people don't read the numbers. No, they made that by writing off debts and whatever else they might have done. So let's leave that there. So where are we now? We have seriously damaged the animal. And what was the animal to me? The animal was a commercially irreplaceable footprint that was an organ of state that could be applied to any channel of services from government to the people of South Africa, particularly in the rural areas and particularly for those who otherwise didn't have access to those services. Post was a piece of that. Paying social grants was a piece of that. When we took over social grants with the Constitutional Court's ruling in our favor, we saved the government 1.2 billion, which they were paying cash payment services to do that. We saved the Gogos 1.4 billion by cancelling the Section 26A deductions from their loans that they'd been foisted upon them. So what do I see? First of all, you must reverse all of that illegality. Post office, to the extent that it's sold properties, it's illegal to sell an asset when you're an insolvent company. Okay, Post Bank operates by way of an exception out of the from a bank license point of view, because National Treasury guarantees the deposits of the depositors. So it operates in an exceptional license. The condition of that license is that Post Bank puts that money on deposit with banks.
Yeah.
They lent it to the post office, which was insolvent. So what could we do now? If we sat down and said, leave the word post office out of the room, what have we got? We've got, what could we have? We could have trusted centres where citizens of South Africa go to get looked after. How would they get looked after? They could have Wi-Fi access. You could download education. You could go there for your vaccination. You could go there for your antiretrovirals. You could go there to get your passport. You could go there to get a funeral policy instead of the 7 that have been thrust down your throat. We could veto one for you and go, this is the right one.
Yeah.
You could go, and so all of these services are just up your street. Okay. Instead of, if you want to go to, get your antiretrovirals, you don't want to get into a bus from Tata, travel up to Baragwana, sit there for 2 days, stay with your aunt. You can just have them delivered to you. Okay. And so it also has certain rights and obligations. How do you match those? You therefore need it, in my view, and this is true of all post offices around the world, you needed to participate in the money flows of the market. And for that you needed a banking license to get access to the national payment system, not to lend money. Lending money is the function of properly thought through credit at established overseas banks. It's not the function of a post office deposit taking institution. Okay. We had great data. We got 11.8 million addresses. We had 6 million depositors. We had access, if you wish, to the Home Affairs database. We could sit and look at the data of our people and go, how can we help?
Right.
And that's what I wanted to do.
Can I ask you this? I had a conversation just moments ago with the Portfolio Committee Chairperson on communications in Parliament.
Yes.
And the question arose as to whether government should continue pouring money into a black hole. I think those were her words. And for one, she's clear that no, that should not be. Instead, we should be trying to rescue this institution, because she is clear on one end that it should remain in government's hands. But then I asked the question, why it should not be sold? I just want you for a moment to listen to the response of Ms. Khusela Sangoni.
So there is a interest, there is a need for the post office to work with the private sector, but there are no discussions yet on the table on, privatizing any parts of the post office. Now, you ask why it is important that the post office remains in state hands. I indicated to you earlier that it's a very critical asset, and it is an asset that also carries the obligation to ensure that there is universal access to communication, particularly for our rural communities and our underserviced areas. They're working together with other parts of the department to ensure that they also extend that beyond what you usually had as traditional postal services, but going into the digital era, extending connectivity, free Wi-Fi spots in all of their branches. Now, we've already seen, in the telecom sector, for example, on issues of broadband, that once you leave such important obligations in the hands of the private sector, they're driven, and rightly so, I suppose, for them, by commercial motives, and you still have the state that has to come in and step in where they are unable to meet those service obligations that we require.
So she makes the point that commercial motives start being the focus for private individuals. Whereas if it is in state hands, you never forget whom this is meant for, and that is the poorest of the poor who live in rural areas. But if badly run, what should be the solution?
Okay, first of all, I totally agree with her. Okay. I totally agree that this should be a state asset. But there's no reason why it can't marry with other inputs. And so the deal, if you might recall, in February 2022, I tabled an offer for the post office at net asset value to be determined by the Auditor General, which included 10% of the shares going to staff, a controlling stake for an international logistics player, which would have turned the post office into a Southern African logistics play, and a stake for the government, which could improve or lessen depending on the outcomes of the future, which we would fund, we the consortium. Okay. and there were certain entrenched rights, like the appointment of the chairperson, like certain no-go areas, all of those things. And the reason why you have to have the state involved, if not in charge, is because the private sector, as she clearly points out, is seeking commercial gain. There are different life currencies for those two bodies. So Postnet and courier companies and all of those companies can do the job very well. But how many people in Mthatha can afford to pay for a courier? Okay, so they would find a solution to 3 to 5%, 6% of the population can afford private sector commercial delivery services. And what about the rest of us?
Yeah.
That is not the mandate of government. So you have to have side by side the developmental and compulsory mandate, which is universal, by the way. It's known as the Universal Service Obligation. It applies to all countries around the world where, in return for being forced to deliver to a 1564 corner in Diepsloot, you get the right to exclusively deliver packages less than 1 kilogram, okay? And so there's an equation there. If it was handled transparently and you dealt with the subsidized activities on one hand and the potential commercial activities on the other, transparently, you could get different pools of capital. State assets to fund state obligations, commercial assets to fund competitive, and those two things live side by side. We in South Africa cannot deal with transformation or development without a commercial foundation to fund it. Okay.
So, before I get to that question, because I did say it will be the final question, I just want you to listen for a moment to what one of the people that I assume works at the post office. These are the views of the person who was texting me whilst I was in conversation with the portfolio committee chairperson. He says the BRPs, these are the business rescue practitioners, have crippled the South African post office. There's no rescue done by them. They made things worse and treated employees like dirt. Now, when you made that offer, part of what you mentioned was that staff would be offered 10%.
Given shares. Given shares.
Wow. How do you...
To create vested interest, common purpose. Why do you think we're so good at rugby? 2 reasons. Common purpose and national pride. Okay.
How many employees, I know you led the post office, how many employees stand to lose their jobs if this thing does go into liquidation? But second of all, how do you think those workers feel today when they hear you saying, if indeed your deal had gone through, they would be given 10% shares?
Well, it was public knowledge. It was published in the newspaper, that deal. How do they, first of all, when I joined the post office, there were close to 23,000 people working there, okay? I think they're less than 10,000 now, and they want to retrench another 4,000. I've lost count with the retrenchments. The day I decided I wanted to get involved was in 2015, when I read in the newspaper that the post office was going to retrench 25% of its workers and close 652 branches. When I read that in the newspaper, I approached then Deputy President Ramaphosa and I said, isn't there another way? Isn't there a growth story? And my growth story was centered around the economic value that can be extracted and made out of cohesive data management, which is the new world, quite frankly. Okay. And so, you know, I wish they were here, the people that worked at the post office, because you must ask them. Go and ask them personally what we did, how we changed, how we created from a place where failure was a refuge, that you went to fail to feel safe together, to a place where we started feeling proud of each other. Okay, we changed culture. And by the way, did you ever hear the post office mentioned in the Zondo Commission? Ever? No. Not once. We didn't do that stuff, okay? We just thought it was wrong and we didn't do it. Okay, now, when you start thinking of a valuable state asset as a pot of gold, you change fundamentally its reason for existence. And that's what's happened. And when we saw the social grants starting to go through the post office. When you've got 200 billion of money flowing through your system, some of it can stick to the walls, okay? But I don't own shares in the post office, so I've got no interest in making money. But if you took 1% profit out of that, it's 2 billion a year. Yeah. So they arrived one day and said, we're going to take the bank. I said, no, you're not. Not while I'm here. Okay, because it was an integrated system we needed to work.
So here comes that question. If given the opportunity today, you and that unnamed consortium to say, here's the post office, tell us whether or not you are still keen, and by the way, how much, what's the amount that you would want of the post office? Because if I read correctly, previously you offered something between 60 or 70% of the post office, which means that you would be getting a controlling stake of the post office.
There are various ways you can exercise control. I wanted to have operational control, and the only way I could see that happening was to have ultimate shareholder control with some checks and balances for it. So what would we do now? First of all, I would spend an enormous amount of time getting a common understanding between the state and the private sector inputs and operators as to where we are and where we're going. What's the size of the boxes that we can operate our mandate in, and where the destination is. And once we'd agreed that, if we're in the box on the way there, please leave us alone. Okay, that's the first thing I would do. The second thing is, I'm not sure, and I've said this analogy and I'll say it again, I'm not sure there's a doctor skilled enough to cure that corpse. Okay, so I don't know if it's not dead already. It's got no pulse. Okay, so you'd have to sit and reconfigure it, and you don't have to use the words post office. You go, what do we do with this infrastructure? What do we do with the state capacity? What do we do with the private sector enthusiasm and capital? What do we do with the international experience where, Amazon has done a deal with the UPS parcel service? Why? Because you can buy something on the internet, but someone's got to deliver it. What? Okay, so they did a deal. They owned, I think Amazon owned 25% of UPS. Yeah. Why? Because it makes commercial and practical sense, particularly in our country. Okay, and so you would for the first time sit there in a circle of trust, and you'd go, what can you do? Okay, and what can I do? And can we find a modus operandi where at some point we start passing the ball to each other? At some point, in soccer now, they don't just give bonuses to the guy who scores the goal, they give bonuses to the assist, the guy who made the goal possible. Okay, we've got to get into that mindset. And it seems to me it takes an existential crisis, a threat of death of the institution, before we stop behaving badly and start talking to each other. Now, I'm open for that discussion, but I'm probably not welcome. Okay, but that's okay. There's another me. There are lots of me's, okay?
I've got 3 hard minutes, Mark. Yeah. Are you interested in buying the post office?
Of course, I fell in love with the place, man. It changed who I am. Okay, I went there to teach and I ended up learning. I went there to show off and I ended up listening. I went there having operated in the higher echelons of business, and I found myself in Mitchell's Plain having coffee with an oak who knew why I asked the one guy, I said to him, why has it gone wrong? He said, no, CEO, he said, the trucks are too big. Now, if he'd been to Harvard, he would have said, we've got a logistics optimization scheduling problem. But what he'd worked out is that the turnover had gone down and they hadn't reduced the truck size. So I fell in love with it. When you get into a service of your country situation, it infects you. Because you can see what can happen. And whether it's me or not is totally irrelevant. In fact, if I look at the background here, my current focal point is not the post office, it's Johannesburg. What are we going to do in Johannesburg? Yeah. Now, if you said to me, what would your first prize be? I'd want an opportunity for a short period of time. And by the way, this is interim stuff. This is not forever. I'm not looking for a job. 2 years to go, let's get the A-team. Let's get the bomb squad, okay? And get them on the field in that beautiful city over there and see what we can do to its foundation so that the prospect of economic dignity comes into view. We're not going to solve it. Yeah. but we are going to make people start feeling the same about it.